live stream or not to live stream? How Addis Kodesh survived the pandemic. Rosh Hashanah day 15782. Last year in the lead up to the high holidays, the big question was, should we live stream the high holiday services or not live stream the services? The concern was, since we couldn't have in-person services, that if we didn't live stream the services, people would feel disconnected and might even leave the shul. Now, obviously, live streaming services on Shabbat or holidays raises halachic, legal, as well as meta halachic questions. So last year on Rosh Hashanah, I said, let's take a step back and try to figure out why electricity is even asur, forbidden on Shabbat, being it's unclear if it's even akin to one of the 39 malachot, those creative labors were forbidden to perform on Shabbat. The conclusion was, though it's unclear if it's akin to any of these labors, if we allow the use of electricity on Shabbat, the very essence of Shabbat will be damaged, particularly today because the internet is a gateway to work. At the beginning of the pandemic, many people said, well, at least I get to finally work from home. But then they discovered what people who were already working from home knew. It's a mixed bag. It's great you don't have to commute anymore. On the other hand, there are no boundaries. Not like you leave the office and go home. You work at home, you're always working 8, 9 o'clock, you're getting emails, people expect you to answer these emails and phone calls. There are no boundaries. Look at it this way. Let's say on Shabbat, you decide you're going to go online and read about the Parsha. But before you can get to the web page talking about the Parsha, you see a notification from work. Now you've been distracted. You've forgotten about the Parsha, and your mind is preoccupied with work again. That's why I encourage people who are watching our pre-recorded high holiday service last year to watch it without checking any notifications or emails beforehand, without surfing the web. Just go directly to the recording, watch it, and then shut the computer off. Make sure that the outside world doesn't invade that oasis in time, which is Shabbat and the Chagim, Shabbat and the holidays. Shabbat really is an oasis in time, and there's a beer commercial, an old beer commercial, which makes that point. A man is sitting on a tropical beach, drinking a beer, he's relaxing, and then you hear his work voicemail pick up. And it says, I'm on vacation. If you need anything, send me an email at sgy7, blah, blah, blah. In other words, he doesn't want to hear from you. He's not interested in hearing about work. That vacation is his oasis in time. It's Shabbat, and he's safeguarding it. If we allow people to use the internet on Shabbat, that oasis in time will be forever damaged. In fact, the Talmud allows the rabbis to create new prohibitions to ensure that as the way we work changes, work-related matters do not fall through the cracks, damaging our oasis in time. My friends, what's at stake here is not only the nature of Shabbat, it's the survival of Judaism. Ahad Ha'am famously proclaimed, the Jews have not kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews. The stream of Judaism, which is growing, is the one which is the firmest regarding Shabbat observance, Orthodox Judaism. Stephen Bain, the famous Jewish sociologist, points out the single greatest factor in determining whether one will keep his or her Jewish identity is the proximity to other Jews which he or she lives. And Orthodox Jews live in proximity to each other because they have to be able to walk to shul on Shabbat. By the way, it brings me no joy whatsoever to point out that the liberal denomination's attempts to enhance Shabbat using electricity and music have not worked well. The Pew surveys will tell you that. Now, it's not my type of Judaism, but I really wish they had worked because it would have kept people closer to Judaism. We do have to say Kol HaKavod to Orthodox Judaism for preserving Shabbat And that firmness has really saved Judaism despite centuries of oppression. I remember growing up, my rabbi telling this story. He was at an airport in Europe, and there was a fellow who wanted to say Kaddish. So he was able to gather together 10 different Jews, many of who didn't even share a language. They weren't able to speak to each other, but they were able to pray together the same mincha service. Why were they able to do that? Because Orthodox Judaism had preserved it. That firmness has preserved Judaism, but it was also exposed as a double-edged sword during this pandemic. Many observant people needlessly died because safety regulations were not followed. I'm not condemning the entire observant community. Many did follow these regulations, but too many did not. There were horrible stories about police officers in Bnei Brak, Israel, being beaten up trying to enforce coronavirus regulations. There were stories out of Brooklyn about signs in English which said the yeshiva is closed, but then there was a sign in Yiddish which said, "Oh, we're really a sign in Yiddish saying, "Oh, we're really open. Just go around the back." This refusal to obey these regulations was bizarre because it was a violation of halacha itself. It was ironic. The most observant people were violating Jewish law. After all, pekuach nefesh, saving life, is a core midah. It's a core value. Maimonides bases the mitzvah of pekuach nefesh on Leviticus, Vayikra. You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which man shall live. V'shmartem et chukotai v'et moshtai asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam v'chai behem. Rabbi Akiva says, by the pursuit of the mitzvot, man shall live, not die. With limited exception, one must violate a mitzvah to save his or her life. There's a funny joke which makes the point. A non-Jewish guy puts a gun to a Jewish guy's head, and he gives him a cup of unkosher wine. He says, "Drink this cup of unkosher wine, or I'm going to kill you." The Jewish guy looks at the cup and says, "Well, if you're going to force me to drink it, at least fill the cup up all the way." Drinking the cup is the right thing to do. Shouldn't martyr himself over a cup of wine. Years ago, I remember having a guest at my house on Shabbat, and Friday night after we ate, he opened his medicine. He was recovering from cancer. He looked at two different pills and said, "Rabbi Sachs, I'm not sure which pill I'm supposed to take." We wound up getting in the car, and I drove him over to the 24-hour pharmacist to make sure he took the right pill. Was it the right thing to do? Absolutely. His health came first. It trumped Shabbat observance. In other words, we don't live to keep the mitzvot. We keep the mitzvot to live. We would have expected the entire observant community to prioritize pekuach nefesh, to tell people it's okay to daven by yourself or outside wearing a mask in a socially distanced fashion. And many did, but way too many did not. And unfortunately, because of that, many needlessly died. These communities that resisted were struck very hard. The question is, why is it that we had these communities whose whole identity revolves around being observant fail to observe the Jewish law, which prioritizes life? What they did was really a Hillel Hashem, quite honestly. I'm sorry to say it, but it was. It was a shanda for the Goyim to have authorities in New York have to preemptively break up these mass gatherings in these observant communities. I actually think the answer is quite simple. Firmness and observance of the mitzvot is good. As we've said, it's preserved Judaism throughout the centuries. However, here, the firmness wasn't appropriate. We were dealing with a very unusual crisis. It blinded people to what needed to be done. This was not the time to say, I need to be able to daven with a minyan no matter what. The communal desire not to deviate from normality were placed even before God's own very law, and the results were tragic. This was a time for flexibility, not rigidity. This Vova Halacha acknowledges the law needs to be flexible enough to address emergency situations. There's a concept in Halacha called Horat Shah, an emergency ruling. You can make certain changes in an emergency situation, such as telling people it's okay to daven from home. Or as the Orthodox community in Lower Merion did, at first they told people daven at home. And then as things started to open up, they said, okay, we're going to shorten the service so we can be safe and daven outside wearing masks. It's an example of the observant community making the necessary changes in order to preserve people's safety. We at Addis Kodesh made changes as well. We allowed people to say Kaddish on Zoom, even though there wasn't a minyan. Zoom isn't a minyan. We did leave out the Yehesh Shmei Rabbi line, but we made that change during the pandemic so we could still meet people's emotional needs. This is why you have the concept of a Horat shot. Now, you could certainly say, well, Rabbi Sachs, if you can make a Horat shot and make an allowance here, why can't you make an allowance? Why didn't you make an allowance and allow for live streaming of services? You, Rabbi Sachs, were also too rigid. Well, there were practical concerns. Just as we were concerned that people may leave if we didn't live stream services, we were also concerned people may leave if we live stream services, because we were really saying that if we live stream services, we're moving the shul's place on the religious spectrum, really would have affected the identity of the shul and changed our identity. And this reminded me of a teaching from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrona Livracha, of blessed memory. He points out that the story of Yaakov stealing the blessing, the bracha, from Esav, his elder twin brother, is misunderstood. The way it's usually taught is Yaakov had to steal the blessing, or else it would have been Avraham, Yitzhak, and Esav instead of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and Judaism would have died in its infancy, never would have gotten off the ground. But he says if you really look at the story closely, you see, it's just not the case. People miss that when Yitzhak blessed Yaakov the second time, after he already realized it was Yaakov he was blessing, the blessing he gave him had nothing to do with the blessing that Yaakov had stolen from Esav, and nothing to do with being strong and ruling over people. The blessing was the blessing of Avraham. You'll inherit the land, you'll be fruitful, you'll multiply. It was the blessing of Israel. It was always meant to be Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Yaakov didn't need to steal that blessing. It was the wrong blessing. However, he learned this the hard way. His whole life, he was a wannabe Esav. He had wanted to be like his cool elder twin brother. Yaakov means heel, to supplant. When he was born holding on to Esav's heel, trying to push ahead so he can be the firstborn. This sibling rivalry finally culminated in Yaakov stealing the blessing of the firstborn. But years later, as he's heading back to Canaan and about to meet Esav, he has a dream. We're told he wrestles with an angel, but I really think he's wrestling with himself, his own Yetzer Hara, his own evil inclination, which is telling him that he still should be a wannabe Esav. He's wrestling himself, the angel, who's really his Yetzer Hara, and the angel says to him, no longer will you be called Yaakov, the supplanter, the one who's holding on to the heel, trying to be Esav. You'll now be known as Yisrael, as Israel. This is who Yaakov was always meant to be. Yaakov, the term Yaakov, the name Yaakov, is negative in the sense it portrays him as a wannabe Esav. He didn't need the blessing of Esav. He didn't need to try to be Esav. Who is he supposed to be? Yisrael. And when he finally meets Esav, he says to Esav, Kach na et berachti, please take my blessing. What blessing is Yaakov giving Esav? The blessing he stole from him years before, the blessing of the firstborn. He's giving it back. He's saying, I no longer need it. And then Esav asks him how he's doing. And Yaakov responds, Yeshli kol, I have everything. Nobody has everything. What does he mean he has everything? He means he's finally content with who he is. No longer is he a wannabe Esav. He's no longer Yaakov. He's Yisrael. And he's happy that he's Yisrael. He's so happy that he feels like he has everything in the world. Ezahu Asher, who's truly happy, Hasameach Behelko, he who's content with his lot. Chaverim, my friends, this has been a brutal pandemic, but we're here back together again. Had we tried to be someone else, had we live stream services, I'm not sure we'd be back here together. I think it would have been disastrous, quite honestly. Yes, we were flexible where we had to be. We allowed for Kodesh, but being someone you're not meant to be never works. There's a famous saying, everything I learned, everything I needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten. In kindergarten, you're told to do your best. I know it's trite, but what are you really being told? To be your best self, to improve yourself. The word shofar comes from lishafer, improve. The message of the shofar is to improve yourself. We're still here because we've heeded the message of the shofar. We were true to our values. We're attempting to be our best selves. And because of that, we're privileged to be here together, again, listening to the beautiful sound of a shofar. Chag Sameach.